This week on the Wheelhouse, we're talking about, well, we're not talking about Latino voters and what they're doing for politicians. We're talking about what politicians are doing for Latinos. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. It's a show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. Latinos make up a huge chunk of the nationwide electorate. They're the biggest share of newly eligible voters this election cycle. 40%, something like that, of people who will be voting in 2024 who couldn't vote yet in 2020. It's according to a Tufts University research group. But still, some polling shows that Latinos are becoming more and more frustrated with the state of American democracy. A poll from Ipsos earlier this year found that only 41% of Latinos are optimistic about the future of the United States, dropping to about 32% for Latinos in their teens and 20s. Today, we're talking about why that is and what can be done about it. Got a great panel, maybe the most epic panel of guests we've ever put together here today. With me today, very good friend and colleague here at Connecticut Public, Mari Carmen Cajawaringa, Connecticut Public Latino Communities Reporter. Good morning, Mari.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I'm so glad to see you here via Zoom. Charles Venator Santiago, he is right here in studio to my left, all the way from El Instituto at the University of Connecticut. How are you today?
Great to be here.
And then, of course, Christian Paz, senior politics reporter for Vox. Christian, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
And so good to see you on Zoom here today. And, of course, Julio Ricardo Varela, a columnist for MSNBC. I'll note that Julio has worked with Connecticut Public as a consultant on Latino media. Hi, Julio. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
So excited to be on.
So excited to have you all on here. I want to tell folks, join the conversation. Feel free to call us today, 888-720-9677. We have an operator that speaks both English and Spanish. That's right. You can speak Espanol on the show today, 888-720-9677.
Si tienes algunas preguntas acerca de la elección, únete a la conversación en directo. Llámanos al 888-720-9677. Puedes hacerlo en inglés o en español.
That's right. We want a bilingual show today. We'll see if we get it, Charles. You get the first question. What does Connecticut's Latino population look like? And then I want you to help us understand more the population in the nation. Some demographics here.
So at a local level, we have 18.2% of the population. Almost a fifth of the population is Puerto Rican Latino. Of that, about 13% are actually eligible voters, 6% of Latinos and 7% of Puerto Ricans. And again, Puerto Ricans make the largest share of the Latino population in the state at 8.2%. And we suspect it's a lot higher because of undercounts with the census. And then at a national level, Latinos are the largest minority group in the country. That somewhere in between 19.2% and 20% of the population. Almost a fifth of the population of the nation is already Latino.
A lot of evacuees, a lot of sort of climate emergency refugees that came over here after the Hurricane Maria in 2017.
So in Connecticut, we had a large population initially, but they've also returned back to Puerto Rico. What we're seeing now is a lot of people coming from New York and Massachusetts because housing is a little cheaper in Connecticut than New York and Massachusetts.
Any other population groups or anything like that? I understand we have a lot of Peruvians here in Connecticut, including Mari Carmen Cajawaringa.
There's a growing Peruvian population. The largest are Mexican and Cubans. And we're seeing a lot of Central American migration and some South American migration from Ecuador.
Okay, so Christian, we're going to head into this presidential election cycle, which you have to pay attention to Christian's work at Fox. As we head into this cycle, have you heard any politicians making assumptions about what side of the aisle most Latino voters will land on? And then, of course, not Christian Paz, hopefully not Frankie Graziano, but the media. We see it a lot in the media as well.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting because, especially since 2020, it feels like we've had a bit of a reversal in some of the assumptions that politicians make about Latino and Hispanic voters. Up until 2020, right, the assumption was always that Latino voters were part of a core Democratic coalition, that they were essentially base voters that you just needed to turn out and get those big enough numbers, and that they would kind of guarantee victory. Obviously, we saw some shifts of, in how Latino voters turned out and voted in the 2020 election, and that kind of inspired a bit of a reversal that we saw going into the midterms, where the assumption suddenly was, oh no, so yes, Democrats still won a majority of them, but they're suddenly becoming overwhelmingly Republican now. And so the assumption from a lot of politicians, and when you mention the media, in the way that we, as an institution, or as institutions, kind of covered these voters ahead of the midterms when talking about a red wave, the assumption was that we would see a massive exodus, or even like a bit of a realignment is some of the talk that's happening right now about how these voters are going to participate and behave in the 2024 election. And it's interesting, I think, because it just happens over and over again. I feel like for us, we know that saying Latinos are not monolithic or are not a monolith is like the starting point for our conversations. With, that's not where it's ending, but it still tends to be the way that a lot of politicians from both parties and a lot of traditional media still tends to think about these voting communities as one organized and cohesive block, when we kind of know that that's not the way that we function.
Julio, what's responsible for some of these misconceptions and these preconceived notions historically? Can you address maybe before 2020, as we've had Christian very nicely articulate what's happened recently?
Yeah, shout out to Christian Paz, must read for sure. I think the issue, and I've been covering Latinos and election cycles since 2008. I think the big issue is that American media has never really understood this community to begin with because of representation issues. So everything that you talk about, where it's like, oh, Latinos are not a monolith, or, there's a traditional 66-33% Democrat Republican split. Like, can Trump get 40%? Historically, this has always been the case. So we need to go back, and I mean go back to the Ronald Reagan years, the George Bush years. Obama 2008 was sort of this definitive moment in the Latino community that kind of created this Obama coalition that sort of woke us up. Like we became part of the mainstream, I think. And ever since then, there's been this sort of disillusionment with the Democratic Party that on the fringes, you're going to see sort of these 3 to 4% shifts. So in 2012, Barack Obama got 71% of the Latino vote. But you don't need 71% anymore. Joe Biden needs to play in around the 59, 60, 61 percentage space and win swing states. But the biggest thing that a lot of people aren't talking about is how much Latino men have gone for Trump. And let me just toss out this data point, and then in 2016, and this is all Pew Research, Trump, from 2016 to 2020, Trump saw a 12-point increase in support by Latino men. And I actually write about this for MSNBC this week because of the Copa America soccer tournament, and Biden's like running ad. So it doesn't surprise anyone who's covered the community. And so I try to frame it in a way of like, welcome to the conversation. We've been having it for years. So maybe you want to listen to Latino and Latino reporters who've been covering this for a while.
And
sorry,
what I want to do later on, and Julio, what I want to do later on is get into some of the things that could be done to not necessarily address who's going to vote for who, but I guess address the communities as a whole and take care of their needs. Madi, you heard some of these preconceived notions, a lot of these things that people are saying or historically have said about Latino communities. How does this actually square up? How do some of these characterizations, like Latinos are anti-abortion or all in for open immigration, how does this kind of stuff land with the people that you talk to here in Connecticut? How do they feel about that?
Yes, Frankie. So most Hispanics in Connecticut think abortion rights should be legal in all or most cases, but opinions vary based on party preferences, ideology, and age groups. Now, Latinos who aren't tied to political party or a political party lean towards supporting the termination of a pregnancy as a legal right. What this means, Frankie, is a political party that backs abortion rights could have the support of Latinos in Connecticut over who that don't. And opinions are pretty balanced as far as I heard from the community. I could also say that half of Latinos in the state that I talked to are pro-abortion and the other half are against it. And this split shows up across different age groups, particularly millennials in their early 20s to the 40s and those over 50 years old. Frankie, I also heard from South Americans, Central American millennials in Connecticut, and they are mostly pro-abortion rights, which is a big change from older generations who were influenced by religious values from their home countries. And Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in Connecticut also tend to support abortion rights, as their views are fairly similar on this issue. And now, Frankie, for the second part of your question, you talk about immigration. And when it comes to immigration, opinions have shifted dramatically in the last 4 years. Many Latino Americans, including legal immigrants, believe it's crucial to increase border security. This is like a whole different world now that we are hearing from the Latino community, whether they are legal residents or undocumented residents. So these undocumented immigrants or the Latinos that are already here, whether they are residents or undocumented immigrants, they say that it's better to make a reform that benefits everybody, all undocumented immigrants that are already here. And the Latinos that I have spoken to, Frankie, would say that undocumented immigrants committing proven criminal acts should be deported. And the reason is because they believe that these individuals are undermining the hard work and fight for respect and equality that has been going on for many, many years. So, Frankie, Connecticut Latinos are saying that they will strongly support a candidate that will make policy changes at the immigration level and make it easier to sponsor a family member to immigrate to the United States legally.
We're going to talk a little bit about immigration a little bit more, particularly the misconceptions later. I want to pivot here because I want to dive into some of the stories you've written for us in recent months. Tremendous body of work from Mari Carmen here. A couple on the economy in particular. There was a story you did about local officials like Molly Rosado in Hartford seeking to protect undocumented workers she says were exploited by employers. And then testimony we're going to play now from Hartford from resident Lynette Gonzalez about the cost of living while dealing actually with polycystic ovary syndrome.
I can go through almost a packet of like maxi pads in the week that I use them. It's a necessary evil. It also depends on how heavy one's menstrual would be. The heavier it is, more the cost becomes.
This is a story about period poverty that you did, and anything in particular that you'd like to remark on about issues people you've talked to in recent months care about. And obviously, the economy, very tough for everybody right now.
Yes, for sure, Frankie. So we're going to dissect this two differently in different parts. So the first question, when you say about immigration and undocumented workers, there's a use of threat of immigration enforcement to create an atmosphere of coercion and exploitation, and it makes undocumented workers reluctant to report abusive practices. So in my stories, I shared experiences of workers in construction, landscaper, domestic work, the jornaleros, who are the day labor workers, and who face various kinds of abuse. And unfortunately, Frankie, first generation undocumented Latino immigrants often suffer this kind of exploitation, which leads to human and workers' rights violations, wage theft, dangerous working conditions, and both physical and emotional abuse. which is, very sad to see this in the community. Now, it's 2024. Like, why can things change? That's what the community always asks. Now, Frankie, I want to share with you and our audience that according to the Migration Policy Institute, there are 113,000 undocumented workers in Connecticut, mainly in the construction industry. And that was like a couple years ago. So now that number might have changed, might have increased because of the number of immigrants that have been crossing the border. Now, through these stories, I have been in communication with the Connecticut Department of Labor, and some of these workers that I talk to do speak up, regardless of their immigration status. They speak up about the abuses they're facing, and when I talked to representatives of the Department of Labor, they told me that the agency does not track cases based on a worker's immigration status. And that's in a way unfortunate to determine the quantity of workers living through intimidation. So now moving forward to the next, to the second part of your question, which is
and how people are dealing with the economy right now.
Yes. So, when it comes to women and the cost of living, I found that millennials, especially Latino women, feel disconnected from the two major political candidates and their understanding on the daily struggles faced by single mothers and women head of households. So, Frankie, during my interactions with the community, I've heard from women about how they are managing their daily budgets wisely. And for instance, many women prefer working from home to save on gas and keep an eye on their children. They're using coupons more often now to buy groceries, and they're cutting back on buying brand name foods as they are more expensive. Also, childcare costs is another major struggle for this Latino woman. And younger millennial women express a desire to move out of their parents' homes, but affording rent is nearly impossible right now, and buying a house seems like out of reach in this economy. So it's very disheartening to hear this from our community. And I also want to say that a Latina woman say they're unable to afford co-payments to go see their OBGYN visits, or, as you heard in my reporting, Frankie, even affording menstrual products.
That's right.
So many Latina women say they're living through financial hardships. They're trying to improve their situation, but they also face a state regulation that disqualify them from social services if they earn slightly more money. So it's a big disappointment, and it's creating a lot of anxiety among Latina women.
This is my last question for you, Madi. I didn't want to get in the way because you're cooking right now. I appreciate it very much. You're doing very well. Back in March, you followed the work of the local nonprofit Spanish Community of Wallingford, and we're kind of getting into what you can do about some of these things that we're talking about. You spoke to Lisandra Mejia Salinas about efforts to address the needs of people who've moved to Connecticut from outside of the continental United States. Here's what Lisandra said her group would be doing around the election, even for people who aren't yet eligible to vote.
During election time, we will also teach them a little bit about what a ballot looks like. What is election? Why is it important to vote? So that is something that on a yearly basis is covered, because it's never too early to learn about your rights and your responsibilities.
There any other helpful resources you come across that may be able to help prospective voters, Madi?
Yes, Frankie, there are so many across, particularly on the towns that are Latinos are more prevalent, and the work that the organizations like the Spanish American Association in Wallingford is doing is essential, Frankie, to Latinos. And I want to explain a little bit about why it's very important to educate first generation Latino immigrants about the politic dynamics in the United States and how civic and electoral participation affects their daily lives. So it's interesting.
Quickly, if you can, Madi. Yep.
Yes, of course. So, up to 20% of the population, and many of those who are eligible, can make a difference if they enroll to participate in the electoral process. So for those who are speaking Spanish or learn or have more ability in the Spanish language, please visit your local organizations. That's very helpful. There are, for example, in Hartford, the Hartford Public Library, we have the Hispanic Health Council. They provide these resources on how you can enroll to vote and register if you are a legal resident, you have a green card and you've been here for 5 years, then you can become a voter. No, for instance, also in New Haven, we have the Hispanic Alliance of Southern Connecticut. There's another hub of resources in Stanford, like Building One Community. All these organizations in different parts of Connecticut where there's more prevalence of Latino communities can provide these resources and this information. So Hispanics that are eligible, again, to participate, please register and be sure to cast your vote, because that's very important to have a real representation from the top level that will irradiate to everywhere, even in the places that you work and even in our schools. So
thank you so much, Madi. I appreciate that. That's very important advice. And I want to allow Christian, Julio, and Charles to step in really quickly because we're going to break. Do you all have any resources you want to share, particularly locally and nationally, I guess, that people should be paying attention to? Jump in right now if you'd like to.
So I want to make one quick comment on the economy.
Yeah.
Connecticut is an aging state. In other words, the majority of the population in Connecticut is white, and they're aging. They're living in fixed incomes. They're retired. And the largest growing population is the Latino population that is also living in poverty. So whatever they earn, they spend. So we need to focus a lot on the economic development of Latinos. And in terms of resources, we're starting to produce a lot of what the Pew is doing for Connecticut. And you can visit our webpage, the Puerto Rican Studies Initiative.
Yeah. Julio, Christian, you got anything really quickly?
I think, if people are interested in looking at, if they get all politically nerdy and want to look outside of Connecticut, there's several organizations that are conducting very heavy Latino polling. So organizations like Unidos US, Voto Latino have really stepped up and created these incredible swing state, heavily sampled Latino surveys that talk about the economy, that talk about the concerns. So a lot of what Mari's saying is applying in other parts of the country with the Latino community.
Unidos, about 3,000 people sampled in their, we'll talk about this a little later too, 3,000 people sampled in their poll. And New York Times had a story about Donald Trump and eligible voters, and there was about 100 Latinos sampled there. So that's quite the difference. We have to go to break here. Today's episode, well, before I do, I want to say questions like where do I vote can be answered online at portalct.gov/SOTS. It's also a voter registration available there via the portal. Forms available both in English and Espanol. As we get closer to election, stay tuned to ctpublic.org/Latino for relevant content available in both languages. Today's episode, really a continuation of the Wheelhouse and Connecticut Public's election coverage, connecting people to policy. Already tackled, for example, reproductive rights, the role of the media in presidential elections. What are we missing? What's next? Help us cover local and national elections by filling out our survey online at ctpublic.org/election. Fill out the survey there. More on the Wheelhouse coming up next. Stay tuned. Join the conversation. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677.
Si tienes algunas preguntas acerca de la elección, únete a la conversación en directo. Llámanos al 888-720-9677. Puedes hacerlo en inglés o en español.
This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Before the break, we heard from the incredible Mari Carmen Cajawarenga, our very own Latino communities reporter. Now we're going to zoom out and talk about how Latinos are being impacted by the American economy. How are you feeling about how politicians are managing the cost of living? We have both English and Spanish speakers standing by to help get your call on the air. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677.
Si tienes algunas preguntas acerca de la elección, únete a la conversación en directo. Llámanos al 888-720-9677. Puedes hacerlo en inglés o en español.
Three amazing guests with us today: Charles Venator Santiago, Christian Paz, and then Julio Ricardo Varela. I just want to let folks know that, again, you could call in, but a lot of people hurting economically right now. Housing costs skyrocketing. Inflation is stretching people's paychecks pretty thin. We heard earlier about period poverty. A lot of these economic issues are hitting Latino communities even harder, Charles. Why is that?
Well, so the majority of Latinos in the state of Connecticut are living in poverty. They're renters, they have low salaries, and in some ways, some are out of the labor force. So you have a lot of inequalities in the state of Connecticut, and the cost of living is too high.
Christian, is that tracked nationally?
Yeah, I actually worked on this story toward the end of last year. I was taking a look. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York actually has an ongoing regional and then national survey that they run where they basically take a look at how prices and wages are changing around the country and affecting various kinds of families depending on income level and even based off of race and ethnicity. And I thought it was really interesting that they found that for most of 2021, it was Black and Latino families that were getting the hardest, bearing the hardest burden of inflation. And that is kind of a key part of this national story since 2020, since the pandemic began and kind of reordered our politics, that for most of 2020 and into the beginning of 2021, many families, especially those that were lowest income, that were, most living in kind of a precarious economic situation, saw the biggest gains based off of federal help, whether it was direct checks in terms of, helping families during the pandemic, whether it was through unemployment insurance, whether it was through other tax breaks. And that really helped to lift, a generation out of poverty for a very short amount of time. Eventually, that kind of help ran out. And we did see an increase in inflation, and this is what the Federal Reserve Bank was tracking, was that it ended up being that food costs and housing costs ended up rising and taking out a bigger chunk of paychecks for Black and Latino families throughout the second half of 2021 and into most of 2022. And so those kind of reversals where you experience a bit of economic stability for a few months, for a year or so, and then suddenly the blow kind of comes in a different direction where now you have to spend more of your paycheck feeding your family, more on rent and more on housing. And that ends up eating away at those excess reserves, especially hurting those families that needed those excess reserves because they were already kind of living under, living in the red for so long. And so that kind of continues throughout 2022. And although things have now reversed a bit more and changed and kind of settled a bit as wages have increased as well, what we see over and over in a lot of public opinion research looking specifically at these families and how they feel about that is that it feels almost like they experience inflation. It's a thing that happens to them, and there's broader economic theories around this too. That inflation is something that happens to you, but whatever raises or wage increases that you do achieve are things that you yourself did, and maybe you don't view them as the result of this greater macroeconomic picture, which makes sense, right? I don't think most families are going around thinking about how the comparing wage and inflation increases and trying to decide whether or not that means that they're actually better off. They're, feeling like they had to spend so much more money buying the same amount of food that they need to feed their families, and then got a new job or got a promotion or got a wage increase, and they feel like that's something that they accomplished, which kind of putting this all together leads to a picture of a bit of whiplash between a moment of pain and uncertainty at the start of the pandemic, a bit of an economic cushion that a lot of these families experience because of government spending and because of just the fact that there was deflation. People weren't spending during the pandemic and the economy was shrinking, and then you have a massive period of growth that then gets a level of inflation added onto it. That then feels like another bit of whiplash. And then you settle into this period now where there is a little bit more sustained wage growth outpacing inflation, but it's still coming from a place that those increases are coming out of a period of uncertainty and a period of stress. And so that memory lingers, those negative experiences and that feeling like you have to stretch your budget is still lingering. And so a little bit of it takes time and getting used to, making more money, but at the same time having to pay more in
Julio,
prices.
How's this popping up in how's this reality popping up in election discourse?
Yeah, totally. Like I mentioned, Unidos US. There was a new poll released, I believe, in the middle of June, and it was pretty straightforward. You know, they did swing state. They did Texas, Arizona, and California Latinos, and 52% of respondents in the poll said that they're worried about being able to pay next month's rent or mortgage. There's concerns about savings. There's concerns about student loans, and I think this is literally sort of where we're at with this election cycle. To pull it back from a national perspective, and with Thursday's debate happening, the biggest challenge that the Biden reelection campaign has is to maintain the coalition that got it elected, got President Biden elected in 2020, got the successes of 2022. Everyone was predicting that, well, Latinos are going to go Republican, but in 2022 in the midterms, young Latinos showed up, Latinos showed up. They won a lot of races for Democrats. And this comes down to being a turnout issue. Are people going to be connected to the election? Are they tired of two candidates that they believe represent institutional parties?
Would they be disconnected in any way by any particular policies from this recent administration?
I think it's more of a. I think it's if you look over the last 2008, 16 years, say 4 election cycles. Remember Hope in 2008? I think that was sort of the defining moment for a lot of young Latino voters who really went all in with President Obama. And I think what you're seeing is sort of typical, political reactions to things. Not everything that Democrats have done has resonated with Latino communities, particularly when it comes to immigration reform. You can say it's not an issue. You can say it's not important for Latinos, but it is. And there's no way to it is part of the conversation. And I think what you're seeing is a reelection campaign that hasn't really fully messaged correctly what the economic successes of Latinos are. And Christian just so eloquently put it, people aren't thinking about macroeconomics. They're thinking about paying their rent. And like in a place like Connecticut, like the good professor, my fellow Puerto Rican, said, when you have a population that's rent heavy, that is living at the poverty line, sometimes politics, they don't see it, right? So it's important to look at it from a national perspective, but also getting involved at the local level, specifically in communities in Connecticut, is just as important. So, sorry, Frank, go ahead.
888-720-9677, the number to call if you want to talk to us this morning. Again, both English and Spanish language speakers on the line to try to get your call through today. 888-720-9677. Locally, there's been a big labor push in recent years, Christian. Paid sick leave, minimum wage increases. Is there any evidence that labor measures like raising the minimum wage are effective or maybe impactful to prospective voter X?
It's definitely a way of getting at some of some of voters' concerns over what we're seeing over and over are specifically concerns with prices, right? And so I think it becomes a messaging question, just like Julio just said, where you need to have candidates explaining the connection between raising the minimum wage, explaining the connection between expanding labor protections and labor rights, and what that means, whether there are trade-offs or not. Does that result as, people who might oppose some of those measures argue that ends up creating new costs for employers, and that those are costs that they pass on to consumers or pull back in other ways to workers. But then you're getting into big macro and microeconomic questions there again too. And so it becomes, as I said, a messaging question of how you explain that, yes, boosting something like the minimum wage is another way of kind of accelerating wage growth and another way of helping folks keep up with rising costs. I think on the converse side of it, This is something that the Biden campaign, and before it was officially the campaign, when it was just the administration talking about its accomplishments, one of the things that they tried to begin to message on that a lot of progressives were advocating for was for a harder push on the concept of price gouging or of corporate greed, and making the case that a lot of what we were seeing in terms of rising costs and rising affordability issues was the result of corporations and the super rich kind of taking advantage of a period of inflationary growth and the post-pandemic reopenings to make more profits, essentially, to take advantage of the fact that people will feel like they need to spend more and raise prices beyond what they might need to be, and in turn another concept of shrinkflation, where prices may be higher or the price might be the same, but the product that is being delivered to you is in a smaller quantity. Those are some of the very concrete ways that people experience the economy, experience the effect of how much their paycheck is going, how much it's stretching. And it's something that the administration tried to make a bigger deal of toward the end of 2021 and to the beginning of 2022, but has since kind of reversed, because then they went through the Bidenomics route, trying to advocate for defend their industrial policy and investments in manufacturing, and that, which is a shrinking part of the overall economy in general, even if it has seen some growth during
Charles,
the Biden
you
years.
wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah. So let me add three structural dimensions in Connecticut that we shouldn't lose sight. The first is that, for example, in Connecticut, you have to be a registered voter to participate in the political process. In other words, to participate in the conventions, to select primary candidates, you have to be a member of a political party. And a lot of Latinos are not identifying with a political party. They become independents. So despite the fact that the state may be meeting some of those needs, or a particular party may be addressing those issues, if they're not members of the party, by the time they get to elections, they're not going to find representatives that reflect their own issues. A second dimension that I think to add to this conversation is, for example, in the state of Connecticut, we have the Democratic Party sometimes undermining its own candidates. We see the case of Anabel Figueroa in Stamford, where the Democratic Party is running a primary against her, sending the wrong message that the Democratic Party has a mixed feelings about Latinos in the state of Connecticut. And that highlights the problem of trust. So even though there are efforts to address these economic issues, sometimes political parties undermine the ability of Latinos to trust government and participate in the electoral process, at least in Connecticut.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Before we go to break, a reminder that you have all the power. And you could determine what we do on a future episode of the Wheelhouse. Help us cover local and national election issues by filling out our survey online at ctpublic.org/election, ctpublic.org/election. Don't go anywhere. More Wheelhouse is next. Matter of fact, call us up right now, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677.
Si tienes algunas preguntas acerca de la elección, únete a la conversación en directo. Llámanos al 888-720-9677. Puedes hacerlo en inglés o en español.
This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Today, we've identified populations of Latino communities living in Connecticut and beyond. We've tackled election coverage of Latinos, which includes misconceptions about the psyche of voters. To kick us off, though, let's get a caller here as we go into the C segment. We have Amy from New Britain on the line. Go ahead, Amy.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Go ahead. What's your question or your thought?
Okay. My thoughts are that there are too many Palestinians being killed in the war, and that there's a great famine going on of Palestinians, and that President Biden needs to earn my vote. If he wants me to vote for him, he needs to do more towards a ceasefire, stop sending arms to Israel, and make sure that the aid gets to the Palestinians. Israel is blocking it from getting to the Palestinians.
Thank you so much, Amy. I appreciate it. And now Maria is going to come up next, and she's going to address us. Go ahead. In Espanol.
I am so happy to hear that kind of program in the radio.
Gracias, María. Gracias.
My opinion. ¿La puedo decir en español?
Sí.
Bueno, mi opinión es, estoy de acuerdo con la señora anterior. El problema de Gaza e Israel tremendamente no ha hecho nada el gobierno y no lo van a hacer nunca en el futuro. Yo lo entiendo, pero que estén mandando ayuda y armas para que maten civiles, no doy mi voto yo para esa gente. Segundo, la inmigración. Pudieron hacer algo fuerte y no lo hicieron. Now, DACA, cada dos años, para sacar dinero, para llenar solicitudes. Eso no está bien. Entonces, hay que pensar uno bien el voto. Y está muy difícil ahora, porque los dos candidatos no sacó uno bueno. Y gracias por tan buen programa. Que se repita pronto.
Gracias, Maria. Thank you so much for calling. I appreciate it very much. Couple of things there from Maria and Amy, Christian, that I'm going to have you unpack here. We're talking about Gaza. We're talking about civilians, as we just heard from Maria. We also heard about undocumented immigrants there and DACA. But let's talk about specifically how much the war in between Israel and Hamas right now is impacting the vote and really is making people not necessarily talk about the vote, but is impacting the psyche of Latinos in America right now.
Definitely. Well, it's one of those issues that definitely gets a fair share of media coverage for very good reason. It is interesting to note, though, that while there are, I'm thinking here of a few of the polls that I've taken a look at that've tried to track how public sentiment might be changing because of the war. It was definitely something that, has affected the way that voters are thinking about engaging in the process, whether it's something, whether it's worth participating in the electoral process at all. But then when you do look at voters who would say that they are likely to vote and consider themselves highly motivated to vote, it's among those voters where the issue does not tend to rank as high, especially, among Latino voters, for example. The things that keep coming up over and over again tend to be those, the economic, inflation, affordability issues. And then immigration comes up definitely where there's a little bit of, tension over both wanting to have, stronger border security and border control, but at the same time, having a more humane and accepting policy of folks who are already living in the U.S. In the past, I've had folks tell me that it's almost like an all of the above approach, which is the way that Latino voters are viewing immigration. And then when it comes to the war in Gaza, that does tend to rank much lower in terms of priorities or in terms of maybe being like the tipping point issue that will determine their vote in November.
We're now thank you so much for that context. And we asked that question of Christian because he's covered that for Vox. So thank you so much, Christian. Charles, a lot of people looking for a path to citizenship. It hasn't always been so easy. Maybe a little bit easier in post 2008 world, but still a trouble looking for a path to citizenship. Why is it so hard?
So three issues that have been highlighted so far. One is this whole DACA situation. I mean, President Biden suspended sort of DACA reauthorizations, and that's created a problem. Second, there's been this lack of funding by Congress to address issues of asylum seekers, which facilitate the process. And third, there's been a sort of shift by the Biden administration to sort of appease some of his critics in some ways. How should I say? Emulating or tolerating some of the Trump more authoritarian policies towards immigrants.
Leaning more into here, I want to play a clip that Madi has collected in her reporting from Barbara Lopez from Make the Road in Connecticut.
Closing the border won't prevent people from coming to the border. They will continue to come to the border and now are forced to wait in Mexico and crowding in unsafe conditions.
Is there a lot of people that are feeling this way, that are talking this way, or might it be a different tone, Julio? What do you think?
No, I actually think there is, just because, this issue, I'm going to put on my time machine hat, really became...
How far are you going, though? You got to tell me the year.
96.
96, okay.
Yeah, that's not that far away. Like,
we're getting in our Ford Contour or something like that.
Exactly. Like, we still had, MySpace back then. But I do think this notion of criminalization of immigration has become sort of national policy. Obviously, in a post 9/11 world, people tend to forget that, ICE is a very young agency, so it's the Department of Homeland Security. And I think we as a country have really not delivered on our immigrant past. And, in a state like Connecticut, there's a lot of, immigrant families, but also families that came from immigrants, at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century. And I think we do a really, really bad job in showing why we need immigration in this country. And again, to Charles's point, it's not only Connecticut that's aging, it's the entire country. So if we want to be a competitive nation moving forward, if we are the greatest nation in the world, or that's sort of the thing, and if we still export the American dream, which I might add, seems to be attracting a lot of people. It's a really good marketing message.
We're going to start to wind down Go ahead, Julio, make that quick point, and then we're going to start to wind down.
It's really important that we start putting immigration in the context of economic prosperity and not as a deficiency for this country.
Christian, just really quick here, Ipsos, I think it found earlier in the year that over half of Latinos are in favor of giving the president the power to shut down the border if too many migrants are coming in. Does that sound accurate to you, at least from some of the stories that you've worked on? And why might folks be feeling that way?
Yeah, I'm definitely cautious whenever we do make big generalizations about how those polls are capturing these things. But what we can say is that it is mirroring a bit of a shift that's happened among the general American electorate, which is we have over the last 20 years seen a general move in favor of viewing immigration more positively than historically a very anti-immigrant kind of approach was the default. But then something happened during the pandemic years after the Trump presidency where, sentiment kind of swung in the opposite direction a bit more. And we do see a little bit of an increase in some worries and some concerns. And I think what Julio says that there's still, Gallup has tracking data on this that shows that when you ask folks whether they think that immigration is a good thing for the economy, there's a little bit of waffling, but it tends to err on the side of, yeah, probably it does. And what that mirrors is a general sense of ambivalence and confusion among the greater American electorate. That is now kind of showing up among the Latino electorate too, as the Latino electorate grows and becomes more diverse and more complicated too in the way that it's viewing this issue specifically.
We're going to sneak in, Christian, one more caller. Let's hear from Angel, and this is a little bit of a change of topic, so we'll see if one of you guys can answer his question really quickly. Angel, let's talk about not having maybe a third choice here. I know there is a third, maybe fourth, fifth choice, but maybe not the one you want, or at least a national popular one. Go ahead.
Yes, as an independent voter, I have no affiliation. And my question, and kind of a comment as well, is where is the coverage or conversation on any other person or party that's running for president?
Thank you so much, Angel. I appreciate it very much. He's looking for that third-party candidate. I might say that you can go back to one of our previous episodes of the Wheelhouse and look at our third-party politics show and talk about some of the roadblocks that are in the way, particularly the two major parties, the Biden administration and, of course, Donald Trump's folks, lawyers, challenging this status in court. That's a big thing. I do want to say before we round out the show, thank you so much, Angel, for your comment. I appreciate it. I want to round out the show by giving a quick shout out to Somos Connecticut, which is an initiative from Connecticut Public to elevate Latino stories and uplift our local Latino communities. For more resources, stories in Spanish, we had a couple of callers in Espanol today. Information on our effort to connect with Latino communities, visit ctpublic.org/Latino. What a show. Charles Venator Santiago, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Pay attention to his work at El Instituto in the University of Connecticut. Christian Paz, thank you so much for your work. You're from Vox. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Julio Ricardo Varela, thank you so much for coming on the show. You can see his work at msnbc.com.
I loved it. Thanks again, Frankie.
Really quickly, help us cover local and national elections. Visit ctpublic.org/election. You'll see my friend Ali at the bottom of the screen with his octopus arms and an orange take survey button. Be sure to take that. Click on ctpublic.org/election. Show produced by our dear friend Kay Perkins, Chloe Wynn. Special thanks to Sabrina Herrera for helping us out with today's episode, knocking it out of the park and helping us get some help from Valeria Orojo and Tess Terrible, making the phones happen. And thanks to our maestro, Dylan Reyes, and Katie Tolarski, our executive producer. This is The Wheelhouse. See you next week.